Hey Becca! So as you know, this video is to show you how to make iris paint and iris films because of everything going on and we're not allowed to be in the lab together. Angelia and I thought it might be the best for me to make a video to show you how to do all this stuff, and then you can reference back later whenever you need to, and in the future if anyone else needs to know how to make the paint or the films, they can look to this for some guidance. So you should have the SOPs for both the iron and manganese paint that I prepared for you, and then you should also have one for making the films themselves, so you can reference that during the video and go back whenever you need to. So I hope you enjoy and can learn something, and if you ever have any questions or need anything, feel free to reach out to me. Also, Lauren Mosesso should still be here for the duration of your time here, and she has made the iron paint as well. So if you have some issues that you can't work through online with me, you can always reach out to her and she might be able to help you in person. So I hope this is informative and I hope you enjoy. All right, so first things first, make sure you put on all of your personal protective equipment, or PPE. This stuff isn't super dangerous, but we want to make sure we protect ourselves, and the paint can get on your clothes sometimes and it does not come off. So make sure you have a lab coat on while you're doing this. So the first step is to get some stuff ready. So we have our ferric chloride and potassium hydroxide. So ferric chloride, you want to measure out 16 grams. You can see this stuff is yellow, and it gets on literally everything that you touch. So always use your gloves and try not to touch anything when you're using that. And then the potassium hydroxide, we're going to mix in a 500 ml volumetric flask with DDI water to make a solution. So we'll take that over to the hood and I'll show you that. All right, so over in the hood, we have a 500 ml volumetric flask that's already partly full of DDI water, and we have 28.05 grams of potassium hydroxide, and then we have some more DDI water to top off the volumetric flask. Right now the hood's off because I wanted you to be able to hear me, but make sure you always have the hood on, and I'll show you how to flip that switch just in case. And what we're gonna do is just add the potassium hydroxide to the flask, mix it up a little bit, and then add the rest of our water, and then mix that up until it's dissolved. So I'll turn on the hood, make sure your light's on so you can see really well, and I'll turn the camera around so you can see this. All right, so we'll leave our potassium hydroxide solution in the hood, and we can get some water ready in a beaker for our paint solution. So we'll gravimetrically add 500 mils of water to this large beaker. Go a little bit over, that's okay. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, so don't worry about that. So then we're gonna take the beaker over to a stir plate. So we're gonna add a stir bar to our beaker. The bigger the better, but sometimes the bigger ones are hard to find in the lab, so whatever you can use is fine. And then we'll add our 16 grams of ferric chloride very carefully. So remember, it can easily stain whatever it touches. And we'll just use a little bit of water to make sure we get all that out. So now that is done, we'll put our beaker on our stir plate, and you want to turn it up to about 200 RPM, and let it stir until the ferric chloride is dissolved. All right, so we are at pH 1.85 and the stir plate is on 200 RPM, and I'm going to slowly add 100 mils of potassium hydroxide. You can see that precipitate already starting to form. And I'll let that pH adjust as I go get some more potassium hydroxide. All right, so our pH is up to 3, and it's pretty stable around there, so we'll add another 50 mils. And you can see the solution is starting to get pretty thick. That is the iron precipitating, which we want to see. So our pH isn't going up too much, so I'm going to add another 50 mils. You might need to turn up the RPM on the stir plate if you see that it's not really stirring as that precipitate starts to form and it gets really thick. So our pH is still around 3.5, so I'll add some more. Just another 50 mils of potassium hydroxide. So at this point I've added 250 mils of potassium hydroxide, and our pH is around 10.5 at the moment, and it's climbing, so I'll wait just a little bit for it to stabilize. All right, so it looks like our pH has stabilized around 12.5, which is a little bit over our target, but that's not a problem. I've had it a little bit over that before. It's really hard to get it right at 12, so no worries there. But just for reference, I added 250 mils of potassium hydroxide. So because I'm not able to spend a ton of time in the lab at a time, right now I'm not going to show you all of the steps of making the manganese paint because it's super similar to the iron paint, but I'll run through it just really quick so you have an idea of what it is before you do it. So for the manganese paint, we use potassium permanganate, which is kind of a gray color in the bottle, solid, but when you add it to water it turns purple, so that's really cool, and it's really pretty. And then we have sodium lactate, which is stored in the refrigerator, currently in 107, but in Warlow I'm sure you'll know where it goes, and it's a syrup. So measuring that out, I normally use a pipette to get the right amount. So when manganese paint was first made, you can read Marty's paper or papers, if you haven't already, on the synthesis of manganese oxides and how they came about that. But basically Marty's lab came up with a new recipe kind of that included a higher molar ratio of potassium permanganate to sodium lactate. So for this method you use a lot more sodium lactate in order to create more of these manganese oxides, and it takes a lot more time. So you don't have to do anything with the pH, you just add these two together, potassium permanganate and sodium lactate, and you have to let it stir for 2 hours. So that's all on the SOP that you have, but you will just add the potassium permanganate to your water, and once it's dissolved, add the sodium lactate and let it stir at that 200 RPM. If you need to turn it up, if it's getting really thick, you can turn it up to 300 or 400, and then just let that stir for 2 hours, and then you're going to let it settle out for about 45 minutes. So you get a really dark brown, like this manganese paint that's already made. It's a really dark brown color compared to the iron paint is more of a orangish red. So once you have both of the solutions or suspensions settled out, the process is exactly the same. So I'll show you that for the iron paint, and it'll be the same thing for the manganese paint. But basically we're going to pipette off this Supernate, and we'll want to dispose of that in a waste container, and then we'll go over to the centrifuge and I'll show you the next steps for that. All right, so as I mentioned, our next step is to pipette off this Supernate after the solution has been sitting for 30 minutes to let it settle out. You can let it sit longer than that if you want to, but it's not necessary. So as you can see, we have this really clear Supernate here, and then our precipitate at the bottom. So what we're going to do is take the 10 mil pipette and set it for the volume of 10 mils. It's kind of hard to pour this off. You could try to do it if you wanted to. So it is a little time consuming to pipette it off, but you keep a lot more of the precipitate if you do it this way rather than if you try to pour it off. And you're not going to be able to get all of the Supernate because you don't want to start sucking up the iron oxides. So I'll just go through this really quickly, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, so as you get down to a more thin layer of Supernate, you might start to pick up some of that precipitate. You don't really want to do that, so you can kind of tip the beaker up a little bit and try to get as much off as you can. All right, so that's about as much as I'm going to be able to get off there, but you can see we collected quite a bit. So this can go into a waste container, and there should be one already made that I have used previously that's not full, so you should be able to use that to dump this in, and then we'll move on to our next step. So we're going to move on to the centrifuge washing step of our iron paint, and we have these centrifuge bottles specifically for this purpose, but these bottles get kind of hard to open as you do this. We're going to centrifuge about 3 or 4 times, sometimes 5, and these seals get really hard to open once they get wet and then centrifuged and then wet again. And Frank and Sean could tell you a pretty funny story of me trying to get one of these bottles open, but so I recommend just using these 250 ml bottles that we have in the cabinet, and make sure you label it. You're going to be with this bottle probably the whole time that you're doing this, but just in case someone sees it or you have to leave for a minute so somebody doesn't know what's in that bottle, some strange orange liquid. So make sure you label that well, and we're just going to equally put our precipitate into these bottles. So you'll want to carefully, it's not very thick, but just try to carefully pour it into the bottle, and we'll get our next one open. You want to try to get as even of an amount as possible in both bottles so that the centrifuge is not off balance. So now we have our bottles ready to go, and we have this pretty dirty beaker here. So you'll want to rinse this out with some water and put it in your waste container a couple times just to try to get as much of that out of there as possible, and then you can wash the beaker with the normal procedures. So we'll move over to 107 where the centrifuge is, and once you get to Warlow. Again, you'll know where that is. All right, so now we're over at the centrifuge. This is our centrifuge. In Warlow, you might be using the Schober Lab centrifuge, which is a little bit newer, a little less finicky, but I'll show you how to change out the rack on this one. So this rack is for a 50 ml Falcon tube, and we have 250 ml Nalgene bottles, so we're going to need to change out this rack. So somebody can show you how to do it in the lab, but I'll just give you a little tutorial. So you just have to loosen that screw there that's holding the rack in, and then it easily pops, sometimes easily pops out. Make sure that the centrifuge is off when you do this, otherwise it's not gonna come out, and the centrifuge should be off anyway if no one's been using it. So just make sure it's in the off position. So I took out the 50 ml rack and put in this 250 ml rack, and you just want to tighten down that screw. This one sticks out quite a bit, so you just want to tighten that down and kind of pull up on it, make sure it's not super loose. And then we're going to put in the 250 ml cups there, and you're going to do all 4. So now that we have our rack in, and I have my bottles, I'm going to shake them up, and then we're going to put them on opposite sides of the centrifuge. Close it and latch it, make sure that it's locked. We're going to turn it on without the timer, because for this one the timer is broken and it won't work with the timers on. So you'll come over here, and we want this to be on about 1500 RPM for 5 minutes. So this speed control's a little wonky. I normally put it on 17 or 18, but if you're using the Schober Labs centrifuge, you can set it directly to 1500 RPM. So you can see when we take the bottles out of the centrifuge, we have this really good separation of supernatant and our precipitate down here. So since this has been centrifuged, it's a lot more solid down here, so we can pour it off, but you're still going to be really careful that you don't get a bunch of that iron into your beaker. So I'll just slowly pour it in. You don't have to get it all, but as much as you can. And we'll do it with the other one. So now that you've done that, you can see we have a pretty even amount in both bottles, and you're going to want to fill it with TDI water to about double the volume of what you have in the bottom of the container. So that looks good. So now we'll cap them and shake them up and go for another round in the centrifuge. So our bottles are out of the centrifuge for a second time, and we're going to do another wash to be 3, and then we'll look at the liquid, see if it's not quite cloudy yet. We'll do it for a 4th time. All right, so I've centrifuged this paint 4 times, 5 minutes each time. I don't know if you'll really be able to see it, but it's a little bit cloudy in there, so typically you'll have a really clear liquid on top, but after the 3rd or 4th time it'll get kind of cloudy, and that's what we want to see. So yeah, you can't really see it there, but you'll know it when you see it. So you want to centrifuge until you get to that, and it'll typically be 4 times. All right, so moving on to our last step, we have our solid iron at the bottom here of our bottles, and we're going to put one more round of water in, the same volume as what's in the bottom of the bottle like we did before. So just kind of estimate where you think that is. And you'll do the same thing with the other one. So now you're going to close the bottles, shake it up really well, and then we'll move on to the dialysis tubing. So for our dialysis tubing, you want to cut a good long piece. It's a little bit longer than a foot in length. And the dialysis tubing is in this box right here. It's normally on my bench. Sometimes it might be in this box, but we'll make sure it's in a place where you can find it. If you've ever used dialysis tubing before, it's kind of finicky to get open, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy. So first you're going to get one side of it a little bit wet with DDI water, and you're going to want a pan of DDI water here to have for when we're done. So get the one end of it kind of wet, and we're just going to tie it off so that there's a little bit left at the end. So you can see I tied it nice and tight. There's a little bit, probably a little under an inch at the end there is what you want to leave. And then you're going to get the whole piece of dialysis tubing wet, and especially the end. And then you can kind of just work it with your fingers to try to get it open. You go up and down with it, that normally does the best job. So you want to make sure it's a little bit wet so you can kind of pull it apart. If you're having a hard time keeping it open, you can put a pipette tip in the top to keep it open a little bit. And then what we're going to do is dump our iron paint into the dialysis tubing as carefully as we can, trying not to spill as we do it. Make sure it's nice and shaken up. And you could also do this with a funnel if you want to. You just want to make sure that you wash it really quickly afterwards, so that iron paint doesn't dry and not want to come off. You can also just pipette it into the bags if you want. You kind of want to let it get down in there before you start to dump a whole bunch. So I wouldn't put more than one bottle of paint into one dialysis tube. So you see I cut a little bit too much, but that's okay, because you want to be able to tie it off with enough slack. You don't want there to be a ton of air, so you can kind of get that air out, but you want there to be slack on it, so this is not taut. So we'll tie it a couple inches from where the paint starts. So then we have a pretty loose tubing full of paint here. And then we're just going to put that right into our DDI water, and we'll do the same thing with our other bottle. So we have our tubes of iron paint in a tub of DDI water, and what you want to do with this is you need to change the DDI water for the iron paint in the first 24 hours. You're supposed to change it every 6 hours. So you're going to want to plan out when you start making this, as the lab is right now, where you can't come in as often. It'll be okay if you don't change it right at every 6 hours. If you have to go every 12 hours, that's okay for the first 24 hours, but you really want to try to get in and change it every 6 hours for the first 24 hours. And then for about 2 days, 2 or 3 days after that, you want to change the water every 12 hours. So for changing the water, you're just going to dump out the DDI water that's in there and refill it up so that the tubes are covered in water, and you might have a little bubble that stays up the top, but that's okay. So you'll want to do that for 3 days, changing the water, and then once the 3 days have come, you can carefully take, I'm not going to do it now because it's not ready, but you're going to take one of your tubes, and you'll have your clean bottles. These are the ones that I just used, but you'll have your clean bottles, and you can put the one end into the bottle, and then just slit the bottom of this with a small pair of scissors, and just being really careful not to cut too much. You want to put a really small hole so that it just kind of leaks out of the bag into the bottle. You could also do it into a beaker. It might be easier to not make a mess, but then you'd have to clean the beaker and you'd lose some paint that way. So it's best if you can do it directly into the bottle that you're going to store it in. So then for storage, you're going to put this bottle in the refrigerator, and you're going to leave it there for a few days. And then you can check the paint periodically to make sure or to see if it's forming correctly. So I'll show you, as I show you how to paint the films, a little bit what you're looking for as far as if the paint's ready or if it's not ready. So these past few steps are the same for iron paint and manganese paint. So the last few steps are the same whether you're making iron paint or manganese paint. Once you have your solution separated out, just get rid of that Super-Date and centrifuge wash 3 or 4 times until you see it's kind of cloudy, and then you do the same step with the dialysis tubing. For manganese paint, you can skip the 6-hour step for the dialysis tube washing, and you can just go directly into 3 days of changing the DDI water every 12 hours, and that's all in your SOP as well. So the manganese paint is the same. You can, after the 3 days, put it into your 250 ml bottles, put it in the refrigerator and wait 3 or 4 days. Make sure that when you get it out, there's good adhesion onto your films, and I'll show you that as I talk about how to actually make the films themselves. The paint, you can read in the literature exactly how long it's good for. If you keep it in the refrigerator and you don't have it out for very long, when you are painting films, it can last for quite a while, but it's not really recommended that you keep it much longer than like 3 weeks. So if you check on the paint and it doesn't look like it's really changing structure, then it would be okay. But you just want to try to make as many films as you can with the paint as soon as it's ready to go, so that you know that it's not changing any structural form of the oxides, and then you would have some paint that's not really good to use anymore. So I hope all of that was informative and not too confusing, but if you have any questions, like I said, don't hesitate to reach out to me. You should have my email, but I'll make sure that Angelia has a non-UD email just in case you can't reach me at the UD email. And I wish you the best of luck making this iris paint and the iris films. It's a pretty fun project, and not something that very many people are doing. So enjoy, and thanks.